Thank you, Sheila, and
yes.
Apologies for in joining. I had a small technical problem, and I'm having it now sorted out. Let me take this chance to extend all those who are joining. The book we have today, I want to appreciate authors who had to ensure the back and forth, which is really a normal process that we go through when doing work of this magnitude. But it's because of their patience and resilience that we have been able to come this far. I also take note that we are disseminating this work on a very important day. June 16th is an important day in the history of South Africa. And the authors of this work, most of them were part of those days of the 1976 kind of consciousness that gave a new meaning to the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And it made quite an important, I should say, statement about the place of the youth. Not only in that struggle, but I think in all the other struggles that people are undergoing through the continent. The consciousness of 1976 will remain for South Africa. So it's sort of the 1968 to Europe. For a different kind of the quest for a more progressive politics, sort of the history of the youth and how they shape will be important at that time. And I think for us, 1976, in terms of how the youth step forward to characterize a new momentum, struggle against the apartheid regime in South Africa. But the book does end there. I think it has quite a number of contemporary, and the title of this webinar, Higher Education as a Site for Struggle in Africa, absolutely captures the kind of struggles that the youth are facing in most parts of the continent, in trying to redefine anew the kind of society that they want, in trying to shape the kind of education that they are searching for, and in trying to make meaning on what they wanted to do with that kind of education. What we have in recent memory is how the youth in the higher education institutions in South Africa have in the recent past confronted issues to do with both fiscal and epistemological access to higher education institutions. The different struggles under the banner of Roads Must Fall are quite clear with us today. The very idea of energizing the quest for both institutional and epistemic decolonization in our institutions is quite clear to us of what questions the youth in higher education institutions are raising toward the continent. But this struggle didn't just start the other day with Roads Must Fall. If you remember from the 1990s, higher education institutions across the continent had to confront the very idea that higher education had to be offered as a business toward the continent. Various books have been written about this. The 90s, when most institutions had to close across the continent, academics had to face jail terms, others had to flee to exile. But the momentum for higher education as a site for activism and contestations has been kept on. And currently we are facing all sorts of struggles. You know, we are looking at higher education institutions as sites for social development. a promise which has been with us since most of the countries achieved independence. We were told that higher education is good for the continent because it was going to be the basis of the kind of development that we were searching for. But you know, this has been a little bit elusive. And the current shifts that we are seeing, the current contestations that we are seeing in the higher education space, actually speak to the unfulfilled promises of the site of higher education as a site for inclusivity, as a site for equity, as something good to everybody inside. Say so, but also to in our societies. This is the continent have to face, and who are in the higher education space these days, that this has been a long struggle, and that we shouldn't give up. Now, as a council, this speaks my we have and academic continent. We think that part of the sure that work is an asset trying to make more time. We have had to undertake this work under our academic program. And this goes back, for those who are aware, to the Kampala Declaration and the intellectual responsibility for African on this declaration, because we believe that the very idea of academic freedom forms a foundation upon which all of the contestations that we have about the higher education space, we do believe that knowledge production in a context of expanded academic freedoms and the social responsibility of the academics, be it the research that we are trying to bring up, if they are and academic social responsibility, it creates a possibility that the foundations of the broader society be raised, and that will be the very sure way of trying to address in the higher education space. So we are really proud that we produced this work. We are looking forward to how we are going to start asking questions about what is missing in this work and what the next step should be in trying to fill the gaps that this work has not addressed. We think that the conversation should go beyond South Africa or Southern Africa, as the chapters in this book are limited to the Southern Africa region, and that we look for an opportunity of having to document and share the experiences of what's happening across the continent, with the youth who have to face different circumstances once they get into higher education institutions, and the increasing number of youth who are not getting access to higher education institutions, and the increasing number of youth who are exiting higher education institutions with very different circumstances in terms of their social and economic futures. So thanks a lot. I don't want to take a lot of time from the others. The reflections that you have in this book, and be free to bring forward some of the ideas that have come forward from the time this book was published. And we will be looking forward for further proposals on how we can take forward these conversations. So thanks a lot. Thanks everybody who has joined online. And I want to defer this space to Suki to continue with the next phase of the work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wanda. Thank you so much, Prof, for that very warm welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vukisam Kolomba. I'm the co-editor of this book called Chasing Freedom. And my other co-editor, my partner in crime, was Mr. Suntosh Pillay, who was not able to join us today. But we've got about 5 main chapter authors who've joined us today, who will be presenting on the individual chapters in as far as the topic is concerned. And the topic basically is about higher education being an important site of struggle, and that youth and students in particular being at the center stage of social reforms and nation building in societies in general. So I think the reason why we actually wrote this book was because we realized that students play an important role in society. They play a significant and crucial role in not only transforming higher education, but also transforming society in general. Student movements across Africa have made fundamental contributions, especially when it comes to the educational and political history of the continent and the region and country at large. The student movements have, since the days of liberation struggles, been at the cutting edge of struggles for fundamental change in society, and by focusing on tertiary education in particular, but society in general. And the vision of student movements in Africa in particular have always been about the establishment of a single coordinated system of education in a democratic Africa. The fight to democratize higher education and society at large has often than not been fought largely by students and youths. And youth have basically played an important and central role in ensuring that not only does the higher education system decolonialize and transform, and not just through reforms, but through radical changes, but that society as a whole holistically transforms and changes as well in the interests of the public good. So the reason why, so this is basically one of the main reasons why we decided to co-author chapters of various student leaders and to put together a book of this nature, because we felt that in terms of the market, the gap in the market, that there were very little stories being told in the voices of student leaders themselves, both current and former. A lot of the experiences of the student movement were largely being told by professors and academics, and not told from the point of view of lived experiences of student leaders themselves. And we all know that student leaders have made fundamental contributions, in particular in South Africa, when it comes to racial inequalities, gender inequalities, class inequalities, and we see that reverberating throughout the region and the continent at large. And that is why we committed ourselves as both co-editors to make sure that the voices of students, student leaders, both current and former students, are placed at the center stage of national discourse, so that we can change the narrative that students are apolitical and depoliticized and actually apathetic. We all know that young people play a crucial role in society, students in particular, and their voices and their lived experiences need to start informing some of the policy reforms in higher education sector and in society in general. Some of the things that come out very strongly in the book have to do with decolonialization and transformation of the education sector. The other themes that are important that come out very strongly in the book are issues of classism, racism, sexism, and issues of gender parity and other forms of discrimination in the higher education sector. We know that issues of curriculum reform, as well as making sure that we've got disability-friendly institutions, also come out very strongly in the book. We deconstruct the motives and the experiences of the Freeze Must Fall movement, together with the Rose Must Fall movement, and how these movements have had fundamental impact on not just the lens, the social lens through which we understand the higher education sector, but also the social lens by which, and the political lens by which we understand society at large. We also speak about issues of the funding models in the education sector and why the struggle for free education in our lifetime continues to be an important struggle in our time and in our society. We also speak about access to educational opportunities to poor students from marginalized and local communities like your rural communities. We also speak about and challenge the notion of institutional autonomy, particularly within a democratic environment, as well as look at how student services have been unequal depending on the background from which you come from. So basically, at the core of all these struggles has been the fight to democratize higher education, and especially to make sure that we move towards a new dispensation that honors and actually prioritizes people's basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. And that is why it was quite important for us today to make sure that we provide a platform to deconstruct the higher education sector as a site of struggle, as we believe that the micro is actually a representation of the macro. That's why today we will be discussing and making sure that issues of social justice and redistributive social justice are at the core of our discussions, and the questions of decolonialization are also at the core of our discussions. And we're hoping that today we'll be able to have a bigger discussion and a bigger conversation over and beyond the limits of the South African lens and the regional lens. But we're hoping that today we'll be having a discussion about how higher education has actually been a site of struggle where students and youth have been at the center stage, anchoring and rooting these struggles to make sure that not only does higher education transform, but that society transform more holistically. So we want to make sure that we adopt a Pan-Africanist perspective, looking over and beyond the limitations of the South African experience, because we believe that our struggles as a continent are interconnected, and that indeed a struggle in South Africa, a struggle in Rwanda, a struggle in Nigeria is a struggle for all who call themselves Africans. So that's basically just my introductory remarks to lead and to lay the foundations for our discussions and our discourse this afternoon. And now I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our chapter contributors. We have 5 chapter contributors this afternoon, all of which will be speaking about their individual chapters in relation to the topic, which is higher education being a site of struggle in Africa. The first person I would like to introduce, dear colleagues, is Bandile. Bandile has joined us. His name is Mr. Chikane. Mr. Chikane, his name, I call him Rejo Chikane. He is a lecturer at WITS School of Governance and WITS Institute for Socio-Economic Research, and the author of the book chapter on the authority of Black pain. Then I would like to introduce our next speaker. His name is John Hodgson. He is a consultant for organizational and systems change, learning and development, and he is the author of the chapter of Asinamali. Then our next speaker will be Malaika. Malaika Mahlatsi. She is a research fellow at the Institute of African Thought Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, and she is the author of the chapter on the other side of freedom, lessons that can be learned from the Fees Must Fall movement. And then our last speaker will be Robbie Lange, who is a close brother of mine. He will be speaking on his chapter as well. Robbie Lange, and he is a deputy director of the Network for Higher Education in South Africa, and his chapter speaks of his experiences of Northwest University, where he was the SRC president at the time, and the lessons that he has learned from that particular experience. Otherwise, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I now hand over to Bandile to kick off our discussions on his chapter. Thank you very much.
Afternoon, everybody, and it's so great to be a part of this webinar and just to think about how the world has changed in such a short space of time. It's crazy to think that since 2019 to 2022, where we are now, doing webinars such as this would have been something that would have been more of a contingency rather than a normality. But obviously now, dealing with the era that we're dealing with in COVID and post-COVID and post-COVID, we can now have our own webinars that can connect us irrespective of where we are on the continent and where we are in the world. I would also just like to mention that being involved in this project has been a great experience, not only in terms of just writing the chapter, but I'm sure, as you all know, the fact that it has taken so many years for us to finally get this book published and our voices heard has been a momentous occasion in and of itself. So my chapter speaks on the psychopolitical thoughts on conscientization and decolonization within the Fees Must Fall movement. And these are basically my own psychopolitical meditations on the process of going through Fees Must Fall at the time that we're going through, and a lot of the observations that I had made regarding the discourses that were surrounding Fees Must Fall, being involved in it, and also the post-Fees Must Fall movement. So about a month after the demonstrations had concluded. At the time, I was working as a student psychologist at the University of the Witwatersrand, or otherwise known as WITS. And as a student psychologist, I was working at the CCDU, which is the Counseling Center and the Development Unit of Psychology and Therapy Services and Mentoring Services at the university. And what it offers is free counseling services to students who attend the university, but also to external students who can't afford their own personal therapy and need to speak to somebody. So when the Fees Must Fall movement kicked off, at that time I was transitioning from a student to a psychologist in training, and I just kind of occupied that transitional space of what it was to be a student, but also what it was to be an employee of the university. And what I was struck by and quite troubled with at the time was the disparity of discourses that existed between students and staff. So as students, we knew that the main site of contestation was the ability to pay for education and the ability to receive quality higher education at fees that would be not necessarily restricted, but more reasonable. And, a lot of the stories that were coming from students, and even as myself as a master's student at the time, were the fact that, fees just kept on increasing and increasing and increasing. And it was becoming more and more challenging to pay for quality university education, and at the same time be able to contribute socio-economically to South Africa as a whole. And the second discourse, which was increasingly apparent, was among staff. So staff had been kind of perpetuating this discourse, at least most of the staff who I was surrounded by, that students were unruly, and it was simply about paying for university education and shutting up and just getting that over with. And that was really troubling to me, because I could see from a student perspective exactly how difficult it was to pay thousands and thousands of rands year upon year for quality education, and just that kind of struggle to keep up with paying for fees. And at the same time, to be a staff member who had been looking at students from a different type of perspective. So a lot of the staff members that I was surrounded by were white, older, privileged staff members who were able to, provide for themselves financially and be able to put themselves in a position of privilege to say that, you simply need to keep quiet and pay for your fees, and then you will receive the education that you pay for. And at the same time, to be an identified African or a Black student who is becoming a professional in a field of profession in South Africa that is classically white dominated, and now occupying that transitional phase of being a young Black activist and a young Black aspiring professional psychologist, young Black student in a classically white dominated privileged society, in a classically white dominated privileged profession, and how to reconcile that in terms of how I self-identified. So in the transitional phase that I was in at that time, it was a very alienating for me to now occupy these two positions and to try and reconcile my self-identity. And I was influenced quite a lot at the time when I was doing my master's thesis on the writings of the great Frantz Fanon and his own psychopolitical meditations on what it meant to be a Black individual in post-colonial Africa. And now here we are in post-colonial, post-apartheid South Africa, and a lot of the issues had still not been resolved that were present in Frantz Fanon's time. So in protesting the incongruency and protesting the injustices of neoliberal capitalism, I was put in a position where now I was struck by these disparities, and really just wanting to close the gap between these discourses that existed, that students were just simply being unruly, and also being in a position of having a perspective of now being a professional where it seeks a more balanced, or sought a more balanced understanding and perspective on how protest was now to be understood in post-colonial, post-apartheid South Africa. And I think even after all of these years, the neoliberal and economic circumstances, especially if we were even to consider what happened.
Angela, you got 2 minutes to wrap up.
Yes, ma'am. Especially yes. What happened during the initial phases of the COVID lockdown and the prejudices that were shown against South African Black townships. It shows that we actually still have a very, very long way to go in understanding exactly what protest means and how these socioeconomic injustices still continue to persist in post-apartheid, post-colonial South Africa. So without taking too much more time, I'd like to just say that these are the main issues that were not only present during Fees Must Fall, but are even present in 2022 and probably will be present between now and in the next 5 to 10 years if we do not resolve these issues. So thank you for being part of this project, and thank you for the fact that our voices could be heard, and we must continue to strive for a more equal and socially, economically just society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandela, for those insights. I like the fact that you bring in a personal touch to our discussion based on your own experiences of the higher education contradictions. Next up, we have Mr. Reho Chikane to give a 5-minute presentation and summary of his chapter in relation to the topic. Over to you, Reho, Mr. Chikane.
Yeah, so hopefully you can hear me clearly. My laptop
can hear
is
you,
here,
yes.
but the screen is here. So if it looks like I'm not looking straight at you, it's because of that. So my name is, and thanks so much, Zuki, for this opportunity, you and Santosh. I mean, this book is extremely needed, and I just love the title so much. I've been ranting and raving about the title to friends and colleagues of mine. So well done on that. So, I mean, my chapter, and I don't think I'll take the whole 5 minutes, but I probably will. My chapter was titled On the Authority of Black Pain. And I think it's important to also acknowledge my mind, where my mind was when I wrote the chapter. So I, as a lot of different leaders did, took a break from student politics. So my background in student politics was from my first year, I joined the African National Congress's student wing, for lack of a better phrase, called SASCO, the South African Students Congress. And I moved up the ladder and I did the whole shebang, what you're supposed to do as a student leader. And you join your house committee representing the organization, you join societies representing the organization, you become a branch chairperson, and you go to provincial congresses, and you go to national meetings. And the ultimate goal was, becoming the president of the SRC. Now, I never got that opportunity. It came very close. But if you know South African universities, a lot of the politics before the Must Fall movements, at least the organized student politics, were centered around political parties, right? And centered around how political parties interact with the university management. And because of that, the dominance of SASCO often led to the dominance of their discourse around what issues matter and what issues don't matter. And when I had left the country to go study overseas as this break to get away from the movement, for just the movement, from fees must fall and roads must fall, after like 6 years of activism at that point, it dawned on me that something interesting happened during the protests, especially in South Africa. And it was that the protests weren't led by political parties. And more importantly, the protests often weren't led by SRCs explicitly. And at least this was at previously advantaged universities, so the previously white universities, where there was an animosity against the SRC being the voice of students, even though they were technically democratically elected. And my chapter sought to try and understand why that happened and how it happened. And one of the strongest rhetorics, and I don't use the word rhetoric in like a demeaning way, in any particular way, or condescending, but one of the strongest tools to gain power in the movements was explaining your particular subjugation at the university. And if you're a Black student, it was centered around this notion called Black pain, and how Black pain became an authoritative device as a way of circumnavigating elected leaders. And when I wrote the chapter, I had to reread it a couple times as well. I realized that I might have been a bit too biased towards SRCs in particular, and it's probably because of the political allegiances I had at the time. But it was fascinating to observe this activity of how enunciating and speaking to life, your experiences on campus, allowed you to gain greater prominence within the Fees Must Fall movement or Roads Must Fall than any political party could have achieved. And what this ended up doing is that it put political parties in an awkward space, because it forced these student political parties to try and change their underlying foundational pillars. And if your organization was not aligned with the idea of Black pain or Black consciousness, you would struggle. And what you started observing, and obviously these are my own observations, I haven't tested this across the entire country, but generally from the people that I talked to and the interviews that I did, what you end up finding is that political parties really struggled with this notion of Black pain unless it was already entrenched in their organization. And we could have a whole conversation of why that's important, but I think what I want everyone to take away from is that it opens up a new window of opportunity. And not a window of opportunity in the sense of how we advocate, how we take advantage of the system, but it gives us a window of opportunity of imagining politics that are different on campuses, imagining politics that are different from political parties in particular, that bind us, that force us to follow university processes and instances. And it gives us the platform to say, can we find new tools of understanding what change might look like? Who are the types of leaders? And I go into the chapter of explaining how that can happen. But one of the points that I want to emphasize here is that it comes with pros and cons.
You've got 2 minutes left.
Yeah, it comes with pros and cons. And I think the central aspect of my chapter was trying to understand the pros and cons of relying on someone enunciating their Black pain in order to gain power within the movement. And the pros and cons of that, or one of the biggest cons, is that what if the person is lying to you? Or what if that person has a fundamentally different conception of their experiences at the university? What if that person's not telling you about their privileged background in particular, right? But they're trying to move and shake the movement in a particular way that suits their particular ends. And I think it becomes useful as a way of understanding how leaders are brought up in an organization or structure or movement that doesn't have designated groups. Now, whether I agree with my argument that I made a couple of years ago, I'm not entirely sure. Do I still think it's beneficial? Absolutely. And I think it becomes important when we start understanding where leaders come from and how we move away from political parties being the structure or the foundation for our advocacy for change in one way or another. So that's what my chapter is about. I hope it is entertaining in one way or another, but I'll end off there.
Thank you, Reho Chikane. I particularly liked your contribution about the performance of Black pain and how Black pain can actually be used as a device against Black people themselves and not necessarily towards their interests. So the question then becomes, who is the authority on Black pain, if not Black people themselves? So thank you so much for that contribution. Over to you now, Mr. John Fitch Hodgson, and whose chapter looks at the question of fees and class and Asina Mali. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Zuki. Very good to be here with everyone today. I'm going to try to speak to the topic, which is struggle in Africa, extremely wide, from the point of view of leading, which I want to understand is about learning and about teaching. And so I have 3 observations and then 3 sets of thoughts in the 5 or 6 minutes. I'm going to start with something I quoted in my chapter, which is from the British colonialist T.B. Macaulay, who was central in imposing colonial education in India and across much of the British Empire. He says in 1835, they represent their education as an injury, which gives them a claim on the government for redress, as an injury for which the stipends paid to them during the infliction were a very inadequate compensation. And I doubt not that they are in the right. They have wasted the best years of life in learning what procures for them neither bread nor respect. It's Macaulay talking about Indians under colonial education, but he could have been talking about South Africa 5 years ago or across the continent today. They are in the right, he says. The second is that at a point during the student uprisings about 5 years ago in South Africa, we then read a mainstream newspaper editor writing in a column, Mondli Makanya in the Sunday Times, about students on the streets in Johannesburg, not as a cause, but an unidentifiable, deformed animal. Couldn't be more racist in language if he tried. And thirdly, third observation, went to go to a slogan of students elsewhere in the world in California. A slogan that in this context tells us, in this long colonial context, in a world in which the mainstream media is still saying these are animals, they don't have a cause. Behind every fee, a line of riotous cops. And in South Africa on campus, there's certainly private security as well. That's the way that students ended up being treated, by cops who are riotous and incited violence, by private security, on the basis that society is told they don't have a cause, although even a British colonist 200 years ago would say they are in the right. So on that basis, three sets of thoughts from my chapter, but speaking to the topic and updated. The first around freedom. The book is titled Chasing Freedom, but I think freedom is less something we chase after than something we have to build. Sometimes that involves breaking, but as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, I think abolition, breaking, has to be about changing everything and building things up. So the first of my thoughts is that it's as crucial today across the continent that we struggle for free education, which means democratic education, which means decolonized education, which has to also mean anti-capitalist education. That takes words and that takes deeds, as Paulo Freire, the educator, would say. And in my chapter, I quote a South African worker, poet, cultural worker, Alfred Temba Ngabula, who calls us to real talk and says real talk in this country and across the continent has to be about land, about bones, and about money. Universities, higher education sites should be crucial sites for such real talk, but only if the talk is real and tied to action. And I take, Bandile, you mentioned Frans Fanon. Fanon guides us to say that sometimes it takes political action for us to be able to have real moral talk between each other, because we have to all see each other as human beings to be able to have that kind of talk. And lastly then, as many of the chapters in this book show, we have to be conscious of the many struggles within the struggle, whether those have to do with patriarchy, they have to do with gender issues, they have to do with transphobia. We have to recall that inside the struggle, there are many struggles for the nature of that struggle towards freedom. The second is some thoughts about education at universities, but also before in terms of schooling and beyond. In my chapter, I point out, we like to be told these days by society, mainstream media, education is the way you get beyond poverty. It's an escalator that takes you free. The truth is, of course, as we know, education is mostly a tool of social reproduction that reproduces poverty and inequality and oppression in society, reproduces racial capitalism. Others, of course, from Mandela himself have said education is or can be a weapon. But it can't be a weapon in South Africa or across the continent when we're busy privatizing universities, we're privatizing schooling, we're running things for profit. For example, the struggles today against Bridge International Academies in Liberia, where the school system of the entire country has been largely privatized. And thankfully, due to those struggles, even the World Bank in the last month or two has said, we are no longer going to invest in private for-profit education under pressure. I would say that when we look to education as a weapon, we have to look beyond that. We have to look beyond universities in their formal sense. We have to look to things like the University of Abahlali in South Africa here, which is under such severe repression. Part of the movement Abahlali Basemjondolo, literally meaning the people who live in shacks. And that our task here is what Louis Ricardo Gordon, the brilliant Black philosopher, has called us to a long time ago, to shift the geography of reason so that reason is not seen to exist in colonial metropoles or just in fancy historically white universities, but in shack sites like the University of Abahlali. Lastly then, a couple of comments about pedagogy. I think that when I think about the uprisings and everything I learned, Zuki, I think about the entire uprising process and the protests as a form of public pedagogy, as a curriculum that was teaching us that the curriculum is always about more than what happens in the classroom. It's about the entire structure of the university and society, and that the world teaches us things as a curriculum. So I would close with the question, what did students at the time teach and learn to former students or supposed student leaders like myself and society? Three things. One, as Angela Davis said at the time, how absolutely retrograde our social priorities have become here and across the continent. Two, that colonialism is still current, as Macaulay shows, and that shutdowns, which were central to tactics at the time, are one way of creating a break in time in which to force everyone to engage. And lastly, that we should all reflect on the question of in whose name politics is conducted, not in the name of nationalism, not in South Africa, increasingly in the name of South Africans alone in an Afrophobic kind of way. But what would it mean to conduct politics, not just as students or for students, but in the name and identity of learners and teachers, of lecturers and students? What would it mean to conduct politics on the continent in the name of Mwalimu, to reference Julius Nyerere? Thank you, Zuki.
Thank you, John. And indeed, it takes actions and deeds. And most importantly, our claims are correct. Thank you, John. Then the next speaker will be Robbie Lange, who basically speaks of his experiences as being a Black student activist at the merged Northwest University. Over to you, Robbie Lange Machadiso. Over to you, sir. Please unmute yourself. Robbie Lange.
Yeah, no,
Please,
thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to greet all of you. My network is not, it's some problematic. I think I will present, of course, with a video off.
No problem.
Let me first and foremost say, I want to, of course, salute the generation of 1976 that organized itself under the umbrella of South African student movement. And of course, the one in the higher education sector organized itself of 1973, of course, that organized a protest in all Black university that organized under South African student organization. I'm saluting this generation because I think this generation must be given a credit for laying a foundation for a contemporary debate on transformation of higher education, the decolonization and Africanization of higher education sector. And of course, it suits very well within the current debate on whether do we have African university or do we have universities in Africa? Because some of the contemporary debates and issues raised in terms of language, literature, and curriculum are the things that, of course, Ngugi wa Thiong'o raised in his the book Decolonizing the Mind, and many others. But I want to also salute the generation of Rhodes and Fees Must Fall for shaking the structural foundation of coloniality. Let me move, of course. The other important thing is that in the chapter, being a Black student activist at the merged Northwest University, I also became, of course, allegiance to give credit to the Progressive Youth Alliance, ANC Youth League, Young Communist League of South Africa, and SASCO, and of course, led by the comrades such as Khabatabani, Solibukaba, for organizing themselves within the context of we are members of the community before we become students. And that on its own, they link their struggle with the society and they viewed the university as the microcosm of the society. Of course, the rallying call was a people's education for people's power in pursuit of building a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, and prosperous South Africa. I want to say, of course, the democratic, the issue of the merger in the Northwest, of course, is the crux of the chapter. Democratic government, of course, envisaged the merger that will build a strong democratic institution that will overcome the apartheid-induced divide between historically white and historically Black universities. I like how Wits University coins its transformation in its transformation charter, that transformation is a process of negotiated organizational change that breaks decisively with the past discriminatory practice in order to create environment where the full potential of everyone is realized, where diversity, both socially and intellectually, is respected and valued, and where it is central to the achievement of the institutional goal. Of course, unquote. Of course, some strides have been made in respect to the transformation of higher education, but a lot still needs to be done. Going to the actual measure, in 2003, something happened, and students, of course, led the struggle in the process of the measure of Northwest University, particularly Mafikeng, Poch, and Val. But what the university did, particularly the white racists in Potchefstroom, what they did when students said, you must not close the fourth campus Mangwe in Rustenburg. Rather, let's use it to have a specific or specialization with maybe education in line with mining. But that was not, but because the agenda here was that the whites wanted to dominate the constitution of the statute so that they can continue with the dominance of white within the merged Northwest University. That is why they issued, because they knew that for the formation of transitional governance, there's going to be four pairs per university. Now, because of they knew that they had the support of Val, they had to make sure that the Mangwe is closed, and they took students to Mafikeng as a way of trying to make sure that they have numerical numbers and advance that struggle. And students had the foresight. They even said that the institutional office must not go to Poch, must rather go to Lichtenberg rather than in Potchefstroom, because there's not going to be any difference between the Poch campus management and the institutional office. And that, of course, they saw it as a Pochification of the measure. That is why many Mafikeng students and academics, some of them felt that this measure is not going to work because the submission we made were not taken seriously. The power is centralized into the office of the VC, who they knew that is going to be TNC law to advance. Now, students suffered under the Putachwana regime, student leaders expelled, suspended. They even suffered under the measure because the dominance of the whites with their agenda. Any student who protested was suspended by the vice chancellor or the rectors. But what happened in the main, if you want to understand how the Burde-Bond agenda dominated the measure of the Northwest University, you should read the book.
2 minutes, or 2 minutes.
You should read book published by Ntlantla Make on the barbarism on higher education. I think the experience of students have been written in various books, including the one that is written by Malaika Matlazi in respect to the corridors of death, and of course the experience of Black students trying to live in the historically white institution. But in terms of what must happen, I think the University South Africa structure of vice chancellors must be regulated, because it must be held accountable for poor transformation and failure to ensure that the national plan for higher education, which it said there must be a development of equity plan and implementation of that, including the target in the NDP currently of making sure that there's at least 50 females by 2060. The other important thing is that the stakeholder summit on transformation that was organized by the Minister of Higher Education, its resolution must be revisited, because it has created a structure called Transformation Oversight Committee that is not statutorily recognized by the vice chancellor. So it needs to be, there must be a legal review of that structure so that it can be able to have powers for accountability. The implementation of Swerdin report of 2008 on racism in higher education, it needs to be revisited and implemented. And of course, the revitalization of the presidential working group that Thabo Mbeki established in 2000 and in the year 2000, so that at least the government should come closer to the institution of higher learning and be able to play a strategic oversight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my brother Robbie Lange. Indeed, your book chapter speaks volumes about the negative consequences of racial dominance in our universities, both in the country, the region, and the continent. and that we need to make sure that true transformation indeed takes place in order to transform and change in fundamental ways the experiences and lives of ordinary students on our campuses. Then our last speaker for the day will be Ms. Malaika Mahlatsi, who I reckon is the Steve Biko of our time and our generation. I've said this in public, and I'm saying it in this public platform, that this is the mind of a young woman who I believe is the Steve Biko of our generation. So over to you, Malaika Mahlatsi, on your chapter, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who has joined this webinar to participate in this very important discussion. So I think there's a very deep profundity in the fact that we are having this conversation on the 46th anniversary of the June 16, 1976 youth and student uprisings that brought the apartheid regime in South Africa to its very knees. I cannot think of a moment or a period in our history where the apartheid government faced the kind of resistance and that was so sustained and organized as it did in 1976. And it was sustained because that period would continue. So this struggle of June 16, 1976 did not begin or end on the day. It continued. It has shaped the history of South Africa. It continues to this day to shape South Africa, the very polity, the very economics, and the very cultural understanding, memories, and interpretations of young Black people in particular. And it is very profound, of course, also because it this conversation is profound today because it also happens at a time when the living conditions of young Black people in particular are so continuously and very profoundly looking quite very similar to what they looked like 46 years ago. A lot of the issues that were raised at the time find expression. And so we begin to also reflect on how so much change has happened and also how so much regress is happening as well. And I think that in 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movements gave the strongest illustration of this fact, of the fact that so many years into the democratic dispensation of South Africa, we are seeing so many vestiges of the apartheid and colonial regimes finding expression, not only in our institutions of higher learning, but in the communities that we live in. Because as we understand correctly that education is a site of struggle, it is also a microcosm of the societies in so many ways. It is a microcosm of the society in which we are placed in. The issues of racism, that classism, sexism, ableism that found expression in the language and the narratives within the Fees Must Fall movement also find expression within society. In my chapter, I raise a number of issues as pertains to the Fees Must Fall movement. And this chapter is called, the name of the chapter rather is titled On the Other Side of Freedom, Lessons from the Fees Must Fall movement. And it begins really with a historicization of the movement. Quite often when one reads the narrative that is in the archive of this movement, there is a very intentional presentation of the Fees Must Fall movement as a spontaneous movement. Right? I've heard a lot of political analysts as well speaking about the movement as a spontaneous movement, a spontaneous eruption of protest, a spontaneous eruption or a spontaneous expression of resistance. And that, of course, is not the case, because the Fees Must Fall must be understood in the context of the history of South Africa. And to understand that, there ought to be an understanding of the barometer of struggle that found expression many, many, many decades. In fact, we dare say a century even before the Fees Must Fall protests would erupt in our universities. And these were struggles that have been rooted in the decivilization and dehumanization of Black people in South Africa. And this dehumanization and decivilization that found expression on the dawn of colonialism and into apartheid has continued to find expression in our universities, because as one of my colleagues, John, so correctly said, these higher education system itself is reproducing the very problematic constructs that exist within our society. And we saw that in 2015, and it is what had, gave a lot of meat or a lot of flesh to a struggle that had already found expression. But so many chapters in the book speak about what happened during Fees Must Fall and the experiences of students at the time. My chapter is particularly focused on the experiences of students after the Fees Must Fall movement, because there has not been a lot of reflection that has been done on how deep the psychologically hemorrhaging and bruising Fees Must Fall has been on a number of students who participated both on the front lines and those who might not have. Because during Fees Must Fall, you also had students who might not have been part of the movement actively, who might have left universities for various reasons, but who still were not unaffected by its ramifications. So lessons for Fees Must Fall also must include lessons for what the impact of the struggle for education in South Africa has been, particularly on young Black people. Some of them, and I speak about this in the book that I wrote that Robbie Lange just briefly spoke about, Corridors of Death, the struggle to exist in institutions of higher education, in historically white universities. Some of these students have gone on to die by suicide. A lot of them are still struggling with the traumas that they endured during this Fees Must Fall struggle. And a lot more of these students also had to make the ultimate sacrifices with their very lives. At the Tshwane University of Technology in 2016, the death of Benjamin Pehla was a serious illustration or demonstrated the kinds of sacrifices that young people have had to make for this education in our country. And so I don't think there has been a sufficient reflections on what the cost of the Fees Must Fall movement has been. We often talk about, the very important highlights of it, how it united us, and Reho was speaking now about how it undermined and destabilized the idea that political parties or student organizations linked to political parties are the ones who define the politics of higher education. Fees Must Fall destabilized that. And those are great things that happened, but lives were also put on the line in this process. The lives of Black women, the lives of queer students in our universities, the lives of students living with disabilities that were ultimately and very fundamentally disrupted by the movement and the politics that have emerged after the movement, part of which have been the politics of pacifying the pain of Black students, the pain of students, working class students in these universities, and simply ticking boxes as a way of performing transformation in these universities. And so I think, Zuki and Santosh, perhaps one of the other things that, perhaps as a recommendation or a suggestion for the next book that we must look into with regards to Fees Must Fall and higher education in South Africa, it ought to be about the costs that students and Black students in particular have had to pay for this freedom that we continue to chase. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Malaika. I like the fact that you remind us that this is an opportune time to actually reflect not just on the benefits of the struggle for change in higher education and society through the Fees Must Fall movements, but also to reflect on the costs of the mental health, the spiritual, the emotional, the physical, on the lives of the struggles who waged those struggles at the time. And indeed, as you say in your introduction, so much has changed, but so little has changed. And we need to continue to reflect on the trajectory that our societies are taking as students and youth continue to wage their struggles for freedom and chase after freedom. So thank you very much. Sheila, over to you. Sheila, please, could you kindly facilitate the Q&A with our guests of honor, our audience this afternoon? And also just to say to our audience, if you don't feel comfortable to raise a question on the floor, then you may raise a question or a contribution or a comment via the chats, and we will read the chats online if you are uncomfortable to raise the questions or to make the inputs or the comments on the floor. Over to you, Sheila. Kindly facilitate our Q&A session for today.
Thank you, Zukiswa. So from the chat section, I can see we have 2 questions already, and I will read them out and I will hand over to the speakers to respond to the questions. So the first is, the time for Africanization of higher education in Africa is long ripe. However, the challenge still lies with political experts that have been well trained in Western ideologies, but refuse or are reluctant to champion this cause. How can we bypass this knowledge power structure for the eventual epistemic freedom? Should we wait until the Western trained scholars are all gone, when we are not sure the new breeds of scholars will not follow their path? So I will hand over to the speakers. Who wants to respond to Professor Isaac Oye?
I think John has already responded. John, could you please perhaps give us highlights of your response to the professor?
Thank you, Zuki. My response is saying that the task is twofold. One is to struggle on the terrain that exists. The Prof raises the question of Western academics, hegemonic ideology, the format of existing universities, right? Like, this goes to Rekotofotse's point about political parties, to struggle within the existing structures, basically. That's part of the work. The other part of the work is to build differently and often separately better institutions. So we shouldn't confine ourselves to think about the existing universities. We have to think about sites of learning and sites of struggle outside of those. And what I said in my comment is, Audre Lorde taught us the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But I'm persuaded by Lewis Gordon when he responds to Lorde saying, but slaves, ever since the time of slaves, especially Black people in the world, have used the master's tools to struggle against the master and to build their own better lives. The victory is at the point in time when you make those old Western academics, Prof, irrelevant, I would say. And that's the twofold way I would see the task that you're asking about.
So Zukiswa, I think I'm persuaded by John's argument, right? And I think one of the things that becomes very important is the shifting of the geography of reason. So I'm a geographer, and I'm very deeply married to this idea of geography beyond space, right? And geography beyond place, and that geography, knowledge itself is a geography, knowledge itself, or rather geography itself has a place in the construction and the reconstruction of knowledge. Now, I think one of the things that, becomes very important in reimagining higher education in South Africa, in Africa, or the Africanization of higher education is precisely that, right? It's precisely that of shifting knowledge out of universities, out of the constraints of a very, westernized and Euro-modernized logic to being, to understanding that epistemic justice for Black people resides in an appreciation of what Black people in particular in our country bring to the table insofar as knowledge. So there must be an appreciation that knowledge is not only valid if it's deemed Western scientific in that sense. And I think that's something that, particularly as, students who are part of the Fees Must Fall movement, we need to, and those of us who are still who have, are in higher education like Reho and others, what becomes important is that we need to start agitating within the spaces that we occupy for this geographical shift of knowledge out of the confines of universities into civil, civil society, into organizations like Abahlali Basomjondolo, into organizations like the, the Anti-Privatization Forum, Chisimani, and so on.
Thanks, Malaika.
Thank you, Malaika. Orapeleng, you wanted to intervene on this same question?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think I will just take you from what the latter speakers said. It is important to also understand that I think Malaika put it very well, that it's a matter of organizing and agitating the minds. I mean, it's not a question, of course, of you having been trained in the Western. I mean, history proves to us that we had leaders who brought Pan-Africanism in our continent, who studied there. But it was a matter of how they conscientized themselves, even in the European countries. They attended school there, they learned there, but they came here to even conscientize. the masses and speak about the negritude and mobilize our people behind Pan-Africanism. We can still do that without relying on, because it will be the role of the civil organization, not the political experts or so, but civil organization where we participate, conscientize to make sure that they understand the Africanization of this particular higher education.
Thank you, Robbie Lange. We have another question that's specifically for you. What are the key challenges constraining transformation of higher education and attainment of National Development Plan targets? Over to you, Robbie Lange.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think what is challenges in regard to the advancement of transformation in our higher education, particularly in South Africa here, is because one, like I said, we have situation where let me make example. In 2010, the Minister of Higher Education called a stakeholder summit on higher education. And when you read the outcomes there, he is saying the Council of Universities and all structures existing must hold those in power accountable. But he forgets that the very same structures were structures manufactured by the very same councils. They still play dominance over them. So I think that is what is, of course, stifling transformation in as far as is concerned. Secondly, we have University Vice Chancellors organization called University South Africa, which is very powerful. It undermines even the recommendations that are made by Transformation Oversight Committee constituted by the minister. So it means they just do what they like. They close Mankwe campus, not on the basis that was for the needs of the people, because to them it was not making money. So it is not only the ideological struggle that is taking place within the institution of higher learning, but also the corporatization of higher education rather than serving the public good. The National Development Plan makes the target that by 2030, at least we should have been having a 50% of at least Black female lecturers, students, and the staff. But that process there is no model that, of course, is monitoring that particular implementation, because higher education vice chancellors are also having people in the very same council on higher education. So there is no what you call in this term, checks and balances within that particular thing. I think that is why I called for regulation of this structure of vice chancellors, so that transformation can take place in those particular universities. And of course, representation of student leaders in the structures in the universities. I mean, I'm a former president of the SRC. I would sit alone in the institutional council, in an institutional forum. I go to meetings alone, but when you arrive there, all staff, management are there. That is why even when you present, after presenting, they do as if you have not said anything.
Thank you, Robbie Lange. We have another interesting question from Guy Alfred. Following the perspective of decolonizing our minds and education, what approach or method can African countries use to depart from their colonial heritage? I think I can give this question to Zukiswa, since she wrote a very interesting chapter in the book towards decoloniality in student struggles. Zukiswa, would you want to say a few remarks regarding this question?
So I think, thank you very much, Sheila. So I think for me, the question of conscientization is the first step that we need to actually make and take in moving away from a colonial heritage. And most importantly for me, I believe that you have to recognize that our struggles are not in vain. Our struggles are real. Our struggle for change is actually invaluable. And if we don't recognize that actually we have been wounded by the colonial project of our colonial masters, and that there's a need for us to change and basically to have a radical disengagement from the colonial heritage. Then we won't be able to basically decolonialize the mind. It starts from consciousness, understanding and believing with every fiber of your being that the struggles that we continue to wage for fundamental changes in higher education in particular and society in general are fundamental and are important and are valid. The most important thing that has taken place during post-colonialism is the fact that our colonial masters have delegitimized our struggles for freedom. And the first step towards decolonializing the mind is to know within ourselves as a Black people, as a Black nation, as an African nation, that with every fiber of our beings, our struggles are valid, and the wars and the battles being waged towards fundamental freedoms for Black people in particular, and Africans in general, is fundamental and important. Secondly, we need to take authority over the structures that produce and reproduce oppressions and all forms of discrimination in our society. And one of the most important institutions for changing society are the very same higher education institutions ourselves. We also need political will by not just our cabinet and our presidents, but we need the political will of all those who are in power, all those who are in power, and to recognize and to challenge those who want to resist the fundamental changes that need to take place in society. We all know that nothing will change. Power concedes nothing if not by power itself. So we need to make sure that we take a hold of our power as a nation, and we make sure that we take a hold of the very same institutions that continue to compromise us, undermine us, and to dehumanize us as a people, as a nations, and in societies in Africa. And that's how I would respond to the question of how we go about decolonializing the mind and how we disengage as a conscious effort, as an internalized effort, as an intentional effort to de-engage from the colonial project and the colonial heritage as it may.
Thank you, Zukiswa, for your reflections. This next question, I think I'll give it to Chikane and Bandile or any other speaker who wants to intervene. The question is, should the predominance of English only in academia be questioned as well?
So I can go first. So thanks again. So yes is the simple answer, but it gets a bit complicated. So Mahmoud Mamdani made a very provocative and questionable remark a couple of years ago when we were speaking at UCT, and he said the most successful, and whether you agree with him or not is neither here nor there, but he said the most successful decolonial movement in history, maybe not in history, but one of the most successful decolonial movements was Afrikaans people. And his argument was around how this particular grouping organized themselves. They were seen as outsiders and antagonistic to the English white individuals, but they structured their nation, they structured their authority around the Afrikaans language and the Afrikaans culture, to the point where they then started subjugating other people. But it bears reason to essentially ask the question of how do you bring your language and your culture into the essence of your country as well? Now, what language you choose becomes quite interesting, at least in the South African context, but it speaks volumes of the potential advantages that it gives thousands, if not millions of South Africans in particular, if you said you can learn in your own language. And that you don't have to know, you do not have to exercise. Someone was talking about reason, I think it was John. You don't have to, no, it was Malaika. You don't have to exercise reason through English. It becomes one of the biggest impediments to thinking about decolonizing the mind at the first and foremost point. So I think it's hugely important. Now, the challenges of it is how you practically do it in an institution now. And it's quite interesting to see what UKZN will look like in the next 10, 15 years after the approach that they took around making Zulu one of the predominant languages of learning. At least everyone has to learn it. And it'll be interesting to see what the results are. But yes, the answer is it's deeply important that you need to understand how English in particular inhibits the ability to decolonize the mind by virtue of it being such a predominant westernized, modernist way of communicating.
I think I'm just going to add to what Rokhotsofatsi just said now, something quite, I suppose, a personal experience of some sort. So, I mean, of course, there's no person who participated in the Fees Must Fall, who was part of the Fees Must Fall movement, or any progressive person really, who does not understand how language, to take on a language is fundamentally to take on a culture, right? And how, therefore, the dominance of really colonial languages in South Africa and the African continent broadly places a great impediment on the decolonization struggle. But here's also another reality, is that it's not a, and perhaps this is also, you know, at the heart of the argument we make that the Fees Must Fall movement was not only about higher education, but the struggle for free education. And by free education, we don't just mean free in terms of the finances or economically, but we're also speaking about an education ideologically. That free education is not only about universities. Free education is about society, it's about the communities where we come from, right? And it's also about basic and primary education, secondary education, because in South Africa, for example, we went to, you know, multiracial schools, and where, you know, quite a number of us went to multiracial, but in fact, a number of people who were part of your Fees Must Fall movements and so on, themselves are products of multiracial schools where we would have learned in English, we would have learned in Afrikaans, and in South Africa, until very recently, it was only in grade 9, right, in grade 10 rather, so 3 years before you completed your matric, where you could choose an indigenous language as part of your first additional languages. So many of us would have done English and Afrikaans all the way to grade 10, and only with 3 years left to be in high school would you be then given an opportunity to choose any other indigenous language in place of Afrikaans, right? And in place of a language like Afrikaans. And the implications of, or rather what then happened with that, is that a lot of students would not choose an indigenous language for the simple reason that when someone has learned, say, Afrikaans or English for many, many years of their life, the formative years of their learning, it creates a sense of anxiety and fear to then choose a language that one might not have the academic or that might have not academic training in, right? Because language is also very, you know, our languages are of course about communication and so on, but for a language to be utilized in education, it also has to be a language that is, you know, it must be a language that can be rather examined and trained in, right? So it becomes very difficult then for students to choose that language when they're only left with 3 years of high school and they've been learning these other languages for all these years. So education in South Africa, resolving the decolonial question in South Africa, is not a question of universities alone. In fact, in very many ways, universities are not even the main sides or the main areas where we need to look at this question of language. It needs to begin at basic and perhaps even early childhood level of education. And that's what makes it necessary that the Fees Must Fall movement becomes a movement that is embedded within communities and becomes a movement as part of a bigger collective of organizations, civil society organizations, your NGOs, your community-based organizations and so on, becomes part of something bigger, because on its own, universities and movements like Fees Must Fall and students in universities cannot and will not decolonize education.
Thank you, Malaika. I think I'll hand it over to Orapeleng. Please keep your remarks to 1 to 2 minutes maximum.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think it's we must understand that what colonialism brought is a coloniality of languages and coloniality of race. So now, if we are Pan-Africanist, it cannot be that we would say English can still be predominant anyway. And I think at some point we must also question many universities in South Africa established a Center for African Studies. I think we must also be able to start zooming into them and check the influence that they have in terms of the struggle of dealing with the coloniality of language and culture in our universities. I think Malaika in her book also gives a very clear examples of how Prof. Kuno, I think in chapter 18, Prof. Kuno, who tried to speak African language in a university and seems to have been ridiculed and will be taken otherwise. Now, even academics who wants to, of course, to rise, they need support, and we must give them support in that particular struggle of making sure that African language are recognized and they also form part of the curriculum. In Potchefstroom, students are getting advantage because question papers are written in Afrikaans and English. It means if English is difficult for them, they go to mother language. In other campuses, it's English alone.
Thank you, Robbie Lange. John? 1 to 2 minutes.
Thank you. To be brief, things, of course, I've learned slowly the hard way. I've worked for a number of years in basic and now in early childhood education, as Malaika raises. And we have to recognize, as she mentions, that there are many, many parents of Black children in this country and across other parts of the continent who would choose for children to be educated in English or English rather than, because they think that is better. And I would say it's not our work to say you are wrong, we know better, because we can talk about decolonialism, which we should, but to say people have a legitimate insight and let's engage them there. Their insight is that language is about power. Language is tied to how to rightly and wrongly use concepts and rules in society. And it's not just how to use words in a way that someone else understands you. It's also how to follow the rules and social norms of that society. There's a lot that's been said about that and that can be read about that. And so parents have those kinds of insights and we have to engage them. That goes back to this question of geography of reason that Malaika has picked up on. And the last thing is there's some simple reasons why people are saying this has to be about more than universities. Firstly, in a racist or racial capitalist or patriarchal or society, etc., it would be miraculous if our institutions of education were exempt from all of those oppressions. They are obviously not. And secondly, it would also be miraculous if what happens at those institutions were able to resist everything outside in the world every day of your life. You go to a school, you learn something, you go out into the world, you spend your rest of your day and your life there, the world teaches you a different thing. And so it's not possible for us to change just educational institutions without changing society, because society is teaching people things every moment of their lives. It's only by changing the educational institutions and the rest of society, building new educational institutions, that we can have a hope of success.
Thank you, John. We are at 1 hour, 30 minutes. We have gone way past our allotted time, and we have one final question, which I think all the panelists can answer as they're giving their closing remarks. The final question is, how do panelists view or rate leadership of African VCs in our institutions of learning? Hence, the phenomena of introducing them. Hence, is the phenomena of introducing them really responding to the Africanization of higher education? I think I'll start with Chikane. Your hand was up. I assume you wanted to respond to the English language question. You can respond to both as you wrap up with your closing remarks.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I assume 1 to 2 minutes or 30 seconds. So just a few things. Never trust management. That's my general state of being when it comes to VCs. And it's not because VCs are bad people inherently, but it's because the notion of a vice chancellor is not to protect students. It's not to advance Africanization. Their first and foremost job is to protect the institution and make sure the institution runs. And because of that, if the institution is perpetuating coloniality, if we use that word in particular, then they inherently can't be trusted, right? Even though they might genuinely be good people. And there's a need for vice chancellors in particular to shift from protecting the institution, right, to protecting this project, this decolonial project. And that's a hard shift for individuals to make when at the end of the day, they get reviewed on their performance at protecting the institution and making sure it's financially sustainable. And it's a hard thing for individuals to do, even the most progressive vice chancellor can become the most evil person in the world. And I just want to make one last point, and it's based on the research that I do now, and we've been talking about it a bit. It is not sufficient to decolonize the mind. And I think we might be falling into the trap that we've been falling into for hundreds of years now. It is now very, very clear that the dominant system that's in place in society across the world dictates that even if you had a country filled with decolonized minds, the nature of our international relations, the nature of capitalism means that the system will keep chugging along and adapt to your new viewpoints, but still subjugate you nonetheless. So there's a deep need to think about how you not just decolonize minds across young people, older generations, but it's also about this question of how do you then actively change institutions as well? And how do you just do it, not wait for other people? And this is why I don't like using Afrikaans, because it's a horrible, horrible culture. Not maybe a horrible culture, but they're just doing it. They're building their own schools. They're making their own universities because they just don't care about other cultures and they just care about their culture. And the question then becomes, when do Black Africans in particular do that? They just do it. Forget the democratic system, forget constitutionalism, just create the change, whether it's through violent means, whether it's through orderly means. And I think that becomes the question of when are we willing to just do it and not rely on conscientizing by itself. Not that it's not important, but how do we transfer conscientization into action as well? It becomes deeply important.
Thank you, Chikane. John, your hand is up.
Oh, no, that was from before. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Any other speaker with some reflections on that last question?
Sheila, I will say something. Sorry, Zuki, back to you.
Okay. No, over to you, John.
I'll say something just because I want to just build on what Chikane says, which is absolutely right. One, he's entirely right. These struggles have to be Pan-African and international to have a chance to succeed. But two, on the question of vice chancellors, we have to see this as about institutions, and they're complicit in the institutions. But what I think we should also value, along with the costs Malaika raises, is what students and workers and others showed us was possible during uprisings in South Africa. What they showed me was that they exceeded and surpassed the vice chancellors, that the vice chancellors should have been making common cause with students instead of trying to get out of the trouble of a financial crisis by just raising fees, rather than saying, we need to go together to government to raise this issue and to struggle on this point. That requires vice chancellors not to call police and private security onto campus and to think their job is law and order. It requires vice chancellors, but any of the rest of us who try to make common cause with these kind of struggles, to be honest, to be humble, right? And to recognize that we have to go about these things in a democratic way. And even as we're struggling, we have to conduct our struggles internally in democratic ways. And I wanted to come back to that point. On the one hand, we have to be Pan-Africanist and internationalist. And on the other, we have to be absolutely committed to democracy within these struggles. Otherwise, it's too easy to say the women's issue comes later or anything like that.
Thank you, John. So Zukiswa, over to you for the ultimate closing remarks.
Thank you, Sheila, for facilitating the Q&A questions. Mama? And most importantly, my apologies. There's noise in the background, but it's going to be turned off at the moment. So just to encourage our audience and our guest speakers that they'll be receiving 30% discount until the 30th of June in order to purchase the book, Chasing Freedom. And the code for the 30% discount is Freedom 2022. Mr. Baye has already posted the links where you can purchase both the print as well as the online version of the book. And if you purchase from today until the 30th of June, giving you 2 full weeks, you will get 30% discount, and the code is Freedom 2022. Otherwise, I think from my end, just in terms of the closing remarks, I would like to say that It's time for us as Africans to begin to tell our own stories and the stories of our own people. The time is now, and the time has indeed come. The necessity of documenting our own histories through the voices of our own people who have contoured that history is not only an intellectual imperative, but is actually a moral one too. So this book indeed provides us all as Africans with an ideal opportunity for us to reflect and to continue to reflect on student movements, their challenges, ideologies and practices, and the ways in which we understand not only ourselves as students and higher education, but the ways in which we can better understand our societies and the trajectories that we are taking as societies. So thank you very much to all our speakers for the day. Thank you to our guest speakers and our audience for joining us today. Thank you to CODESRIA, our publisher, who took a bet on us and actually enabled us to come to this point where we are officially launching the book via this online virtual process, which is through webinar engagement. And we are hoping that you guys will buy the book and encourage your own networks to buy the book so that we can continue having these important discussions and important discourses on how best to move towards fundamental changes for higher education and our societies in general. Otherwise, that's it from me. Thank you very much, Sheila and CODESRIA. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to the audience. Bless you and a good evening and a good week ahead.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much. Bless you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.